Everyone. So today we are going to talk about the story arc. So first I'm going to tell you basically what it is, and then I will read you a super short story, and we'll look at the different parts of the arc as they apply to that story. And then on another day, you're going to be applying the story arc to some stories yourself. So let's just get into it. So most stories follow the same basic pattern. We picture it to look like a shape, right? An arc. Um, Things at first in the story will start off normally until there's a problem introduced, and then the events build up until they reach the most exciting moment. And after that, everything settles back down again. And so each of these parts of the story has a name. So let's start naming them. In the early part of the story, we get some exposition. So this is when we learn important background information about the protagonist and their normal life. Think of it as exposing the audience to a little bit of the backstory. So who are the characters in this story? Where is the story taking place? What is that world like? That kind of thing. We learn all that in the exposition. Oh, and by the way, the protagonist, of course, is our main character. All right, so things are going along normally, but then along comes a conflict. So this is where something happens that creates a problem for the protagonist. Every story has to have some kind of conflict or problem, and this is where it starts. A story just isn't a story without a conflict. Imagine if I told you, I went to the store, I bought some eggs, I made an omelet, it was delicious, the end. That's not a story, right? There was no problem. So it really isn't a story. Nobody wants to read about that or hear about that. All right, so you have to have a conflict, and this happens at the end of the exposition. Once the problem's been introduced, we get this rising action. So this is the events in the story that happen because of the conflict. They get more intense over time, and that's why we call it the rising action. So the tension rises, the excitement increases, right? And that's that rising action. And it all builds up to the climax, the most exciting part of the story. And this is where things turn around, things change. The big thing we've been waiting to see finally happens. Um, it usually happens near the end of the story, but not right at the end, not the very end of the story, very end of the movie. It doesn't matter, by the way, if it's a book or a story or a movie or a television show, right? Stories follow this same pattern. All right, so what comes after the climax is the falling action. So these are the events that happen um, after the climax, like I said, and it's when the tension drops. So we can't stay at this high level of stress and tension that we get at the climax. We have to fall back down to normal. Um, So this part is usually pretty short because it's really not that exciting. Really, the big exciting part is here in the conflict, the rising action, and the climax. Here in the falling action, we're just like, oh, we're kind of getting back to normal. So it's pretty short so that it doesn't get too boring. And then finally, at the very end of the story, there is a resolution. This is where all the loose ends are tied up, and we kind of see how things maybe change because of what's happened earlier. Um, this is the and they lived happily ever after type of moment. If that's the ending, I mean, maybe they don't live happily ever after. But in that type of story, that's what we would see in the resolution. All right, to make this a little more concrete, I'm going to read to you a super duper short story, and then we're going to put it, sort of apply this story arc to that really short story. All right, so listen and read along with me. Jordan had always been afraid of spiders until the day he and his friend Brian were hanging around in the backyard. They saw a spider in the grass, and Brian dared Jordan to let it crawl up his leg. At first, Jordan said no. Then Brian did it first to show Jordan that it wouldn't hurt him. Still, he wasn't convinced. Finally, when Brian said he'd let Jordan use his skateboard for a week, Jordan did it. And it turned out it wasn't that bad after all. All right, so in this story, we first learned that Jordan had always been afraid of spiders and that he and his best friend Brian were hanging around in the backyard one day. So that's the exposition, the background information, the situation before anything really interesting happens. So here, during this exposition, we learn who the characters are. We meet Jordan and Brian. We kind of learn where they are. They're in the backyard and kind of the world that they live in and a little bit about them. So we know um, that Jordan was afraid of spiders. All right, so we learn a little bit about them. Then we get the conflict. Something interesting happens, and this is the conflict, right? They see a spider, and Brian dared Jordan to let it crawl up his leg. Now, this is conflict here because Jordan's afraid of spiders. So now he has to kind of decide what to do. So you can imagine here, now Jordan is feeling some stress, right? He has an important decision to make. Should I look like a scaredy cat and run away screaming and crying? Or should I let the spider crawl up my leg? Or should I pick a fight with my friend to distract him from the spider? I don't know. So Jordan's got to make a decision. This is the conflict. Jordan's been dared to do something he's afraid to do. All right, that's conflict. Next, we're going to have the rising action. So this is, remember, this is those events that lead up to the climax. So here during this rising action, we're usually going to have several events along the way until we get to the big moment that we've all been waiting for, right? The climax. So in the rising action of this little story, Jordan said no, right? Nope, not going to let a spider crawl on me. Also, Brian let the spider crawl up his leg to show Jordan that it wasn't so scary. It's another part of the rising action. And then finally, Brian said Jordan could borrow a skateboard because remember, Jordan still, even after Brian did it, Jordan was still like, nope, not doing that. Brian finally said, dude, you can have my skateboard for a week if you just do it. So you can see how this sort of built up to the big moment, the climax, which is here at the top of the arc. So finally, Jordan let the spider crawl up his leg. This is the climax, the most exciting part of the story. After that, we get the falling action. So the falling action is when Jordan realized that having a spider crawl on his leg wasn't so scary, right? This is where the tension is released. So here the tension in the rising action, it builds and builds and builds. And then in the climax, oh my God, the big thing happens, which is a spider crawling on his leg in this story. Well, we can't stay up here at this high level of stress and tension and excitement. We have to come back down to normal. So that's the falling action. Now, this falling action is usually pretty short and quick. It's not all that exciting. And so, of course, a writer doesn't want to bore their reader to death, so they keep this short. Um, and then finally, we get the resolution. Here, the resolution comes from, or is in the form of Jordan being less afraid of spiders, right? So, because this story is very, very short, it doesn't really flat out say that Jordan is less afraid of spiders. Instead, we have to kind of imply, it's implied. We have to make an inference here. So, because it said, hey, it wasn't so bad, right? Um, so you have to sort of figure out or assume or infer, right, that now that Jordan has had a spider crawl on his leg and he realized he's all right, maybe he's less afraid of spiders. So this is the resolution. All right, this is it for today. In the future, very near future, you're going to be applying this story arc to a couple of stories yourself. If you have any questions or concerns, please get hold of me and have a great day.